Okay, wow. You really weren't kidding when you said you wanted to do a deep dive on Adolf Hitler?
Oh, yeah.
We have got a ton of stuff here.
Yeah.
Everything from childhood diaries to like really in-depth historical analysis.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be a lot.
This is definitely heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But I think instead of just like listing a bunch of facts, let's try and understand like the how and why of Hitler's rise.
Yeah. It's a really complex and disturbing journey, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have to unpack a lot here, from like psychological factors that shaped him to, you know, the political climate that really allowed his whole ideology to take root.
Right, because we've all heard the basic story, but
Mm.
I think I'm really curious to go beyond that.
Absolutely.
So let's start at the beginning. His childhood, it wasn't exactly a Hallmark movie, was it?
No, definitely not. A lot of the sources really kind of focus on the impact of his father, Alois,
Right.
and he wasn't just strict. Some people describe him as like downright abusive.
Right.
Imagine growing up in that kind of environment, constantly walking on eggshells.
Oh, yeah.
And then you add on top of that the loss of his younger siblings and the devastating blow of his mother's death when he was just 13.
Oh, yeah.
It's a lot of trauma for a young mind to process.
It's heartbreaking, and it's hard not to wonder how much that early trauma, contributed to his later cruelty.
Yeah.
But, I mean, millions of people have difficult childhoods,
Yeah.
and they don't become dictators.
Right, exactly.
Right.
It's tempting to draw a straight line from trauma to tyranny,
Right.
but it's a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
What's interesting is how Hitler himself actually used this whole narrative of a difficult childhood,
Right.
to his advantage, turning it into this source of strength, almost like a badge of honor.
Wow.
He really romanticized his struggles in Mein Kampf,
Oh, wow.
using it to connect with people who felt similarly disenfranchised.
Wow. So it wasn't just his past, it was how he spun it that mattered.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have this really unstable childhood. And then young Adolf tries to go to art school in Vienna,
Right.
which goes about as well as a lead balloon.
You could say that, yeah, rejected twice by the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts.
Twice.
Put yourself in his shoes.
Yeah.
Imagine pouring your heart and soul into something only to be told you're not good enough, not once, but twice.
Ouch.
That kind of rejection can be crushing,
Yeah,
especially for someone already struggling with their identity.
for sure.
And, Vienna at that time was a fertile ground for extremist ideologies.
Right.
I mean, think about it. Widespread poverty, growing anti-Semitism, a sense of national humiliation after the loss of World War I.
Yeah.
This is where he really starts absorbing those hateful ideas, finding scapegoats for his own failures.
Right. I remember reading about the specific books and pamphlets that he was influenced by.
Yeah.
It's really nasty stuff that unfortunately was pretty mainstream back then.
Right.
But how much of his anti-Semitism was genuine belief
Yeah.
versus a calculated political tool?
Well, that's a question that historians still debate to this day.
Right.
Was it deeply held hatred or just a cynical ploy for power?
Yeah.
It was likely a combination of both.
Yeah.
I mean, he understood the power of scapegoating,
Uh-huh.
of channeling people's anxieties onto a visible enemy.
Right.
And the Jews, already facing centuries of prejudice,
Yeah.
were an easy target.
Right. And then comes World War I.
Yeah.
Hitler actually volunteered for the German army, which always surprises me given how things played out later.
It might surprise you even more to learn that he wasn't exactly a frontline hero.
Right.
He was a dispatch runner, which kept him relatively safe.
Okay.
Yet he received the Iron Cross twice.
He did.
Now, some argue these awards were more about political connections than bravery.
Interesting.
Regardless, they fueled his sense of self-importance.
So even in the military, there's a sense of him kind of being on the periphery, almost observing the chaos rather than actively participating.
Yes.
Didn't the sources mention he was kind of a loner,
Yeah.
even disliked by some of his comrades?
Yes. Several accounts describe him as aloof, even arrogant.
Wow.
He seemed to prefer the company of his own grand ideas to actual human connection.
Yeah.
It's as if he was always analyzing, strategizing, looking for an opportunity to assert himself.
And that opportunity seems to have come in 1918 when he was temporarily blinded in a gas attack.
Yes.
There's a lot of debate about whether this blindness was purely physical or had a psychosomatic component.
Right. The details are murky, but the gas attack was undeniably a turning point.
Right.
This was trauma on top of trauma.
Yeah.
For Hitler, it seems to have validated his distorted worldview,
Okay.
confirming his belief that Germany was betrayed, stabbed in the back by internal enemies.
Okay, so we have a deeply wounded, radicalized Hitler.
Yeah.
returning to a defeated Germany that's in complete turmoil.
Yes.
And this is where he really dives headfirst into politics, right?
Right. He joins this tiny fringe group called the German Workers' Party,
Right,
which, as we all know, will eventually become the Nazi Party.
right.
And it's here that his true talents emerge.
Yeah.
Not military strategy, but something far more dangerous.
Right.
His hypnotic power as an orator, his ability to tap into people's anger and resentment.
Didn't he practice for hours in front of a mirror?
He did.
Perfecting his gestures, his tone of voice, his ability to work a crowd into a frenzy.
Absolutely. He was a master of propaganda.
Yeah.
And he understood that emotion trumps logic when it comes to swaying the masses.
Right.
He weaved his anti-Semitism into a broader narrative of national revival,
Right.
promising to restore Germany to its former glory.
And then, of course, there's the failed beer hall putsch in 1923,
Yes.
an attempted coup that lands him in prison.
Right.
But that prison sentence, which could have been the end of his story, becomes a pivotal moment.
Yes.
He uses the time to write Mein Kampf,
Right.
which becomes the blueprint for his ideology.
Absolutely. And what's truly disturbing is that he was released early, far earlier than expected.
Oh, wow.
It suggests a level of tolerance, even admiration for his extreme views within the German justice system itself.
So even at this stage, the warning signs were there.
They were.
But instead of being marginalized, he was given a platform, a chance to spread his hate even further.
Yeah. And that's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It is.
Because what happens next is the 1929 economic depression,
Right.
which throws the entire world into chaos.
Yeah.
And for a master manipulator like Hitler, this becomes the perfect storm,
People are desperate, looking
Yeah.
for someone to blame.
right?
And Hitler offers them a simple yet seductive solution.
Yeah.
It's the Jews, it's the communists, it's the weak politicians who betrayed us.
It was a dangerous cocktail.
Yeah.
A charismatic leader, a receptive audience, and a message that resonated with deep-seated prejudices.
Yeah.
And it's here that we see his popularity explode,
Right.
the Nazi Party gaining traction at an alarming rate.
But it wasn't just about speeches, was it?
No.
There was also the violence, the intimidation tactics of the SA, the infamous brown shirts.
Absolutely, they were his thugs.
Yeah.
You know, disrupting meetings, attacking political opponents, creating a climate of fear.
Right.
It sent a clear message.
Yeah.
Dissent will not be tolerated.
No.
And tragically, it worked. The Nazi Party's rise to power became unstoppable.
And that brings us to 1933 and the Reichstag fire.
Yes.
Now, whether it was a genuine arson attack or staged by the Nazis themselves, it provided the perfect excuse for Hitler to consolidate his power.
The Reichstag fire was a masterstroke, regardless of who actually said it.
Yeah.
Hitler used it to justify the suspension of civil liberties, to arrest his political opponents, and to pass the Enabling Act.
Right.
This act essentially gave him dictatorial powers, effectively dismantling German democracy from within.
So in just a few short years, he goes from a fringe politician to a dictator.
That's right.
And he doesn't waste any time flexing his newfound power, does he?
No, he doesn't.
The night of the long knives, the purge of his own political rivals, including Ernst Röhm, the leader of the SA.
That was a chilling message, even to his own supporters.
Yeah.
Nobody was safe. Yeah, absolute obedience was the only option.
And to enforce that obedience, he creates the Gestapo,
Yep.
the secret police who become the embodiment of a totalitarian state.
The Gestapo were his eyes and ears, his enforcers.
Right.
They spied on citizens, arrested dissenters, used torture and intimidation to crush any opposition.
Wow.
Fear became the primary tool of control.
But it wasn't all about terror, was it?
No?
He also understood the importance of spectacle, of crafting a narrative of national unity and pride.
Right.
The 1936 Olympics in Berlin were a prime example.
Oh, absolutely. The Olympics were a propaganda coup.
Yeah.
He wanted to showcase a vibrant, powerful Germany to the world,
Right.
masking the true nature of his regime.
Wow.
He even temporarily toned down the anti-Semitism to avoid international backlash.
Wow.
It was a carefully crafted illusion, and it worked.
It's incredible how he managed to manipulate public opinion,
I know.
both domestically and internationally.
Yeah.
He was a master of creating this image of strength and stability, all while building up a military machine and violating the terms of the Treaty of Versailles.
And tragically, it was only a matter of time before that military machine was unleashed.
Yeah.
The stage was set for war.
Right.
And Hitler, driven by his twisted ideology, was more than willing to plunge the world into chaos to achieve his goals.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from a troubled childhood to the rise of a dictatorship.
We have.
It's a lot to process, and it's all pretty disturbing.
It is. But I think it's important to remember that Hitler was not some superhuman monster.
Right.
He was a human being,
Yeah.
albeit a deeply flawed and dangerous one.
Yeah.
And by understanding the factors that allowed him to rise to power, perhaps we can be more vigilant in recognizing and confronting those same dangers in our own time.
Well said. And on that sobering note, I think it's time to move on to the next chapter of this deep dive World War II and the horrors that followed.
Okay.
So last time we left off with Hitler firmly in power and Europe, on the brink of war.
Right.
It's hard to imagine, the world holding its breath knowing what was about to be unleashed.
It's a period of history that still sends chills down your spine. You know how this story ends.
Right.
The unimaginable suffering, the sheer scale of destruction.
Right.
But I think what's crucial here is understanding, how we got there.
Right, because Hitler's ambition wasn't just about restoring Germany to its former glory.
Right.
There was something far more sinister at play, wasn't there? This whole idea of Lebensraum, living space, and a master race destined to rule.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He envisioned this vast empire in the East, populated by Aryans, with the Slavic people either subjugated or eliminated.
Right.
It's a chillingly distorted worldview fueled by racial hatred and this belief in German supremacy.
And to achieve this twisted vision, he was willing to plunge the world into another devastating war in 1939. He invades Poland, triggering a global conflict. And initially, his blitzkrieg strategy is terrifyingly effective.
The speed and brutality of those early victories were shocking. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, all falling in rapid succession.
Wow.
The world watched in horror as Hitler's armies seemed unstoppable.
Yeah, it's almost like a nightmare unfolding in real time, but what's often overlooked is his pact with Stalin, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact,
Right.
which essentially carved up Eastern Europe between them.
That pact was a cynical power play.
Yeah.
It gave Hitler the freedom to conquer westward without fear of a two-front war.
Right.
And for Stalin, it was a chance to buy time and expand Soviet territory.
Right.
It was a deal with the devil, and tragically, millions paid the price.
Then in 1941 comes what many consider Hitler's biggest blunder, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. What possessed him to think he could conquer that vast, sprawling country, especially after Napoleon's disastrous campaign a century earlier?
It seems to have been a potent mix of arrogance, racial ideology, and underestimation.
Yeah.
He genuinely believed that the Soviet Union was weak, that the Slavic people were racially inferior, and would crumble before the Wehrmacht.
Wow.
He fatally misjudged both the terrain and the tenacity of his enemy.
And that miscalculation proved disastrous. The invasion of the Soviet Union became a brutal war of attrition, a bloodbath unlike anything the world had ever seen. Millions died on both sides, soldiers and civilians alike. It was a living hell.
Stalingrad in particular was a turning point.
Right.
The German army, trapped and besieged in that city, suffered a catastrophic defeat.
Right.
It exposed the limitations of the Blitzkrieg and marked the beginning of the long, slow decline of the Third Reich.
But even as the tide turned against him, Hitler refused to accept defeat. He became increasingly isolated, issuing irrational orders, clinging to power with a delusional grip.
There's a clear pattern of self-destruction,
Yeah.
a refusal to acknowledge reality.
Yeah.
He micromanaged the war effort, overruling his generals, obsessed with holding on to territory, even when it was strategically pointless.
Wow.
It's as if he was willing to sacrifice everything, including his own people, rather than admit defeat.
And then there's the failed assassination attempt in 1944, the July 20 plot. A group of German officers desperate to end the war and remove Hitler from power plant a bomb in his headquarters, but it only wounded him.
Imagine how different history might have been if that bomb had been a few inches closer.
Right.
But it wasn't meant to be the failed plot. Only deepened Hitler's paranoia, strengthened his grip on power, and led to even more brutal repression.
And it's in this atmosphere of paranoia and desperation that the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of European Jews, reaches its horrific climax. It's a subject so difficult to comprehend, the sheer scale of the genocide, the industrialized nature of the killing.
It's almost beyond human comprehension, and what's so chilling is the cold bureaucratic efficiency with which it was carried out.
Right.
The sources detail the Wannsee Conference in 1942, where high-ranking Nazi officials met to coordinate the final solution, their euphemism for genocide.
They discussed logistics, transportation methods of killing all with a detached, almost business-like approach. It's the banality of evil, the way this monstrous crime was planned and executed by seemingly ordinary people.
And it raises the haunting question, How could this have happened?
Right.
How could a civilized nation, a nation of poets and thinkers, descend into such barbarity?
There's no easy answer, is there? It's a complex web of historical, social, and psychological factors.
Yeah.
But one thing is clear, it wasn't just Hitler. There was widespread complicity, a willingness to look the other way, to believe the propaganda, to participate in the persecution.
And that's the truly terrifying part. It
Yeah.
reveals the dark potential that exists within all of us, the capacity for cruelty and indifference.
Yeah.
We can't simply blame it all on one man. We have to confront the uncomfortable truth that many individuals, institutions, and even nations played a role in this horrific chapter of human history.
And that brings us to another difficult question. Why wasn't Hitler stopped sooner? The sources mention various forms of resistance both within Germany and across occupied Europe, but they were often fragmented, poorly organized, and brutally suppressed.
The Nazi regime was incredibly effective at crushing dissent.
Right.
They had a vast network of spies, informants, and enforcers. Fear and propaganda were powerful weapons. And there's also the uncomfortable truth that the Allied powers, while ultimately fighting against Nazi Germany, were slow to prioritize the rescue of Jews.
So it was a perfect storm of factors, wasn't it? A fanatical leader, a totalitarian state, a deeply ingrained ideology of hate, and a world that for too long failed to fully grasp the magnitude of the unfolding horror.
And even as the war was clearly turning against him, Hitler clung to his delusions of grandeur, his belief in his own destiny.
Yeah.
It's a chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked power, of the seductive allure of fanaticism.
It's a lot to take in, and it's incredibly disturbing, but I think it's crucial to confront this history, to learn from it, to never forget the victims, and to be vigilant against the seeds of intolerance and hatred that can take root anywhere at any time.
You're absolutely right. The lessons of World War II and the Holocaust are as relevant today as they were 70 years ago.
Yeah.
We can't afford to become complacent. We must constantly be on guard against all forms of extremism, against any ideology that seeks to dehumanize and demonize others.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to move on to the final chapter of this deep dive. The end of the war, Hitler's demise, and the complex legacy he left behind. Last time we were talking about the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, and it's hard to fathom the desperation and the chaos of those final days as the Allied forces are closing in on Berlin.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
we started by talking about, Hitler's grand visions for architecture, for, reshaping entire cities. And here he is holed up in this damp, claustrophobic bunker, a symbol of his crumbling regime.
Yeah, it's almost Shakespearean. This fall from grace, this dictator reduced to hiding underground as his world collapses around him.
The sources paint a pretty vivid picture of those final days.
Yeah.
Hitler isolated and paranoid, lashing out at his inner circle, refusing to accept the inevitable.
And yet, even as Soviet troops were battling their way through the streets of Berlin, he refused to surrender.
Yeah, he was trapped in his own twisted reality, convinced that he could still somehow turn the tide. Even as defeat stared him in the face.
And then on April 30th, 1945, he chooses suicide, taking his mistress Eva Braun with him.
Right.
A macabre ending to a horrific chapter in human history. But it's interesting how all these myths and conspiracy theories still persist even today,
Right.
The idea that he somehow escaped, fled to South America, lived out his days in anonymity.
It's fascinating how these myths persist, isn't it?
It is.
The idea that he somehow escaped, fled to South America, lived out his days in anonymity.
Yeah, I've seen those documentaries. The ones that claim his body was never actually found, that the Soviets staged the whole thing.
Right.
It all adds to this mystique, this almost mythical status he holds in some circles.
I think the lack of an official autopsy certainly fuels the speculation,
Right.
but the evidence overwhelmingly points to his suicide in that bunker.
Right.
His remains were reportedly burned by his followers and later discovered by Soviet troops.
It seems like some people just can't accept the fact that this larger-than-life figure, this embodiment of evil, ultimately chose a pathetic end in a dingy bunker.
Maybe it's easier to believe in a conspiracy than to face the reality that someone so destructive could rise to power in the first place.
Right. So with Hitler gone, the war in Europe finally comes to an end, but the world is left to grapple with the devastating consequences of his actions. The millions dead, the shattered societies, the scars that would take generations to heal.
And then there's the challenge of, understanding his legacy.
Right.
How do we make sense of this man, his twisted ideology,
Yeah.
the horrors that he unleashed? How do we learn from this dark chapter in human history and prevent something like it from happening again?
Those are huge questions, and I don't think there are any easy answers, but one thing is clear, we can't just sweep it under the rug. We have to confront the past, even the most uncomfortable parts of it.
Absolutely. In
Yeah.
Germany, the process of denazification, of confronting the legacy of the Nazi regime, was a long and painful one.
Yeah.
It involved everything from holding war criminals accountable to rewriting textbooks to re-educating an entire generation.
And it's an ongoing process, isn't it? Because the legacy of Hitler goes far beyond Germany. His ideology of hate continues to inspire extremist groups around the world, and even in mainstream society, we see echoes of his tactics, the use of propaganda, the scapegoating of minorities, the manipulation of fear and anger.
It's a chilling reminder that the dangers that allowed Hitler to rise to power are still present today.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be complacent. We have to be vigilant to challenge intolerance and prejudice wherever we see it.
And we have to remember the victims, to honor their stories, and to ensure that something like the Holocaust never happens again.
You know, it's been a heavy journey, this deep dive into the life and legacy of Adolf Hitler. We've explored the darkness of human nature, but we've also seen examples of incredible courage, resilience, and the enduring power of hope.
It's a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable evil, the human spirit can endure. And it's a call to action, a challenge to each of us to stand up for what's right, to fight against injustice, and to build a world where such horrors are never repeated.
I think that's a fitting note to end on. Knowledge is our most powerful weapon against the darkness. Let's use it wisely.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep questioning.